It was a cold autumn night in 2015 when I saw something I'll never forget. Alone, running through the streets of Lancaster, I encountered a terrified little girl, lost and begging for help. But when I offered to call the police, her entire demeanor changed. She ran straight into a pitch-black graveyard and disappeared. Who was she? What was she running from? What happened that night still haunts me. Stay with me, and I'll tell you the chilling story. But before we start, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you'll never miss a spine-tingling episode. If you're enjoying the content, don't forget to like, comment, and share the video. And if you want even more, stay connected with us on our social media platforms for more creepy content. Thank you all for being part of this journey with me. And now let's dive into the darkness together. In the autumn of 2015, I was 23 years old, living in Lancaster, a small, picturesque town in the north of England. At the time, I was in my third year at Lancaster University, having already spent 2 years getting to know the area. Lancaster is the kind of town where you can either live on campus or rent a place in the town itself. I had chosen to live in a newly renovated apartment in a nicer part of town, though it was quite expensive. By that point, I had become familiar with the town and felt safe and comfortable living there with a couple of friends who were also students. Since my first year, I had made a point of staying fit by going for nightly runs, either around the university campus or around the town. Living in the town center, I had the freedom to choose between quieter, residential streets and the more lively areas near the student pubs. By my third year, I would sometimes run with my housemate, but I usually preferred to go out on my own, listening to some heavy metal. Deftones was a band I was particularly fond of during that time. One chilly autumn evening, around 8 p.m., I decided to go for a run on my own. I put my headphones in and started running uphill toward a quieter, more residential area. At the top of the hill, there was a lovely park called Williamson Park, with a butterfly museum perched on a hill and a large, somewhat eerie graveyard beside it. The graveyard was huge, with overgrown areas, old gravestones, and an abandoned crypt at its center, which always seemed to be hidden under a blanket of ivy and fallen leaves. What made this cemetery particularly unsettling was the old mental asylum on the other side, in ruins, barely standing. There was a small hole in the fence where people could sneak in, but it was risky. The grounds were patrolled by guard dogs, and it wasn't exactly a place you'd want to find yourself after dark. But on this particular evening, I was more focused on my run than anything else. As I approached the entrance to the graveyard, something caught my attention. A small figure stood near the imposing iron gates, which were at the bottom of a winding path. The figure was a child, around 9 or 10 years old, and they seemed frantic. The child appeared to be crying, and they were looking over their shoulder, as though something was chasing them. I felt a sudden sense of unease, but assumed they might just be lost or in need of help. When I got closer, the girl noticed me and rushed toward me, clearly distressed. She was wearing a thin dress, no coat or jacket to protect her from the cold. I remember thinking how inappropriate her clothing was for the chilly Lancaster evening. She asked if I could help her, her voice full of desperation, and she kept glancing nervously at the dark graveyard behind her. The whole scene felt off, as the graveyard was pitch black, with not even the faintest hint of light beyond the gates. It was an eerie sight, the girl standing there, so vulnerable, with only the thick blackness surrounding her. I don't remember exactly what she said, but I offered to call the police. I dialed 999 and put the phone on speaker, but the girl's reaction was immediate and unexpected. She became visibly upset, her fear turning to anger. She insisted that she didn't need the police and that everything was fine. Her sudden change in demeanor only added to the unease I was feeling. Trying to calm her, I offered to walk her to the police station, which was a good 20-minute walk back down the hill. But then, in a move that left me frozen, the girl turned and ran straight into the graveyard. She didn't hesitate or look back. She just sprinted into the darkness, disappearing from view in an instant. The silence that followed was deafening. I stood there, utterly confused and shaken. Who was she? Why was she alone? Why had she been so terrified of the police? Why had she run into the graveyard without fear, as if she knew something I didn't? I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, and I suddenly felt very alone in the dark street. I didn't waste any time. I turned and ran as fast as I could, not stopping until I reached the well-lit, busy area closer to town. I never went for a run alone at night again. The memory of that strange encounter stuck with me, leaving me with more questions than answers, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly avoided something unsettling that night. I'll never forget the 2 weeks I spent working nighttime security at an old cemetery. It was far from my ideal job, but when the agency I worked for transferred me there, I didn't have much choice. You see, I had gotten into some trouble after an incident involving a wealthy family and a misunderstanding during my security rounds. I can't go into detail about it, but it led to this unwanted transfer. The cemetery was the oldest in the city, considered historic, and recently had signed a contract for nighttime security after a couple of grave robberies. Though the robberies had only happened twice, they were enough to cause concern, and the agency was taking no chances. As the first security guard to cover night shifts there, I had no previous experiences or advice to rely on. From the start, I hated the place. Walking around the burial grounds at night, it was impossible not to feel unnerved by the darkness and the silence. I made an effort to get used to it, but it only made things worse. One of the graves that had been robbed still hadn't been fully restored, the grass not yet replaced, and the eroded marker told the story of a woman who had lived to a ripe old age. I paid my respects and moved on, though I couldn't shake the eerie feeling. The first few nights were uneventful. It was mostly quiet, and I began to fall into a routine. Working from 8 p.m. to 8 a.m. 3 nights a week left me exhausted, especially with the drowsy hours in the middle of the night. The coffee was more like water than anything else, so I started napping when nothing was happening. After all, who would bother trying to rob graves with a security guard around? But there was one night, the last of my 2-week stint, when things took a turn. I was completely drained from the previous shifts and had no energy left to stay alert. I dozed off in the booth, and soon I was deep asleep, drifting into a dream. It started off benign, but soon it turned into a nightmare. I remember feeling a sharp pain in my stomach, waking up to see an elderly woman standing over me with a shovel. She was digging into my abdomen, tearing me apart. I couldn't move, couldn't scream, just lay there, helpless, as she eviscerated me. It felt so real, more vivid than anything I'd ever experienced. But then somehow, I managed to wake myself up. My eyes snapped open, heart racing, and I froze. There, on the other side of the booth window, was the exact same woman from my dream. She was staring at me, her gnarled face pressed up against the glass. I jumped back, my breath caught in my throat, and when I got back on my feet to check, she was gone. I knew I had to check the grounds, but I was terrified. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, trying to shake off the fear. The night air was cold, and under the full moon, the cemetery felt even more unsettling. As I scanned the area, I spotted a figure in the distance near the edge of the property, by the trees. I shouted at them, but they didn't respond. A rustling sound from behind startled me, but it turned out to be nothing, just a possum scurrying away. I tried to reassure myself, but the figure was still there, standing motionless. I called out again, but when I looked back, it was gone. I couldn't understand how she'd moved so quickly. I walked toward the back of the property, unease growing with every step. As I moved deeper into the graveyard, the forest around me seemed to go wild. Birds took off in a flurry of noise, and even a pack of coyotes started howling in the distance. It felt like the entire forest was warning me to stop, but I couldn't shake the feeling that if I didn't keep going, something worse might happen. Finally, I reached the back of the cemetery. I looked around, but there was no sign of anyone. Just as quickly as the chaos started, everything went quiet. No animals, no sounds at all. The air felt heavy, and I turned to head back. only to realize I was standing right on top of one of the robbed graves, the one I'd seen the woman's marker on just days before. Before I could process this, cold hands gripped my throat and I was shoved down into the dirt. I couldn't see who was attacking me, but they were incredibly strong. My face was slammed into the freshly replaced dirt again and again. I struggled to breathe, feeling like I might pass out from the pressure. And then, just as suddenly, it stopped. I bolted to my feet, gasping for air. But no one was there. It was as if everything had vanished. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I couldn't make sense of what had just happened. It felt too real to be a hallucination. But there was no one around. That was the moment I knew I couldn't finish my shift. I ran to my car, not even bothering to lock up, and quit on the spot. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night, but I've come to believe it was the spirit of the woman whose grave had been disturbed. She didn't take kindly to me slacking off, and she made sure I learned my lesson. I'm not someone who typically believes in the supernatural, but sometimes, events happen that make you question everything you thought you knew. Even now, when I'm at work, if I feel the urge to slack off, I can almost feel her watching me, a reminder of the lesson she taught me. Visiting my father's grave always brings a mix of comfort and sorrow. He passed away from cancer when I was only 7, so my memories of him are hazy, but filled with warmth and love. My mother often tells me I inherited his big hazel eyes and his lively spirit. Despite not having had much time with him, she's kept his memory alive through stories and memories. A few times a year, she takes me to his grave, and we care for the simple granite headstone, laying fresh flowers and tidying the area. It's always a quiet, personal moment, and I often find myself silently updating him on my life, as though he were there. It's a cathartic tradition, one that makes his absence feel just a little less painful. But the visit I'll never forget happened recently, and it was nothing like the others. That particular Tuesday morning, the sun was shining brightly as my mom parked near the wrought iron gates of the local cemetery. It was a peaceful, quiet day, with hardly anyone around. We unloaded our tools from the car, including a bouquet of daisies, my father's favorite flowers. The cemetery grounds were quiet, and we made our way toward Dad's plot, which is tucked under a large oak tree. As always, a wave of melancholy washed over me, but I also felt a deep sense of gratitude for the memories my mom had kept alive over the years. We spent about an hour weeding and cleaning around the grave, chatting casually about my college plans. It was a normal visit, a peaceful one. And after finishing our work, we decided to take a slow walk around the cemetery, enjoying the spring air. The paths were winding and calm, perfect for a reflective stroll. As we passed rows of headstones and crypts, something caught my eye on the edge of my vision. At first, I thought it was just a passerby, but then I noticed a man standing behind a marble mausoleum, watching us. He looked to be in his mid-50s, dressed in casual clothes and a faded blue baseball cap. At that distance, I couldn't make out his features clearly, but there was something about his stance that seemed oddly familiar, something that made my stomach tighten with a strange feeling. As I stared at him, a thought suddenly struck me with eerie clarity. His posture, his build, the way he stood. It was the spitting image of my father from old family photos. The resemblance was so uncanny it sent a chill through me. His eyes, even from afar, seemed to meet mine, and it felt like he was looking straight through me. I must have gasped aloud because my mom, who had been walking beside me, asked with concern what was wrong. When I pointed toward the man, she squinted in the direction I indicated, but insisted she couldn't see anyone resembling my father. I kept my eyes fixed on him, but when we moved around a large monument to get a better look, he had vanished. Gone, without a trace. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what I'd just seen. There had been no other mourners nearby, and no one could have walked out of sight in the seconds it took for us to move. The man had simply disappeared. My mom suggested it must have been a groundskeeper or another visitor who resembled my father. Maybe someone we hadn't noticed who had simply walked behind a tree or building. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had seen something otherworldly. I was convinced that I had witnessed the spirit of my father, lingering near his grave. Obsessed, I excused myself from my mom's concern and darted off down the winding paths of the cemetery, determined to find the mysterious man. I searched between rows of headstones and around corners, scanning every possible hiding spot. As I ventured deeper into a more secluded area of the cemetery, dense rhododendron bushes and ivy blocked my view. And then I saw him again. He stood halfway down a narrow, empty path, his back to me. My heart skipped a beat. I approached cautiously, calling out to him, but he didn't respond. As I neared, he slowly turned to face me. There was no recognition in his eyes, no warmth, just a cold, unwavering stare. Driven by something I couldn't explain, I hurried after him, trying to catch up before he disappeared again. But as I rounded a corner in the path, I was met with a dead end, an imposing stone wall overtaken by moss and vines. No way out, no other path, no one in sight. I turned around frantically, searching every direction, but he had vanished again, as if he had never been there at all. I was shaken, my mind spinning with confusion. I stumbled back to the main path, hoping my mom hadn't gone searching for me or called anyone for help. Luckily, she was still there, pacing anxiously. When she saw me, relief flooded her face, though there was still a trace of frustration. I quickly explained what had happened, my words tumbling out in a frantic rush. But as I described the man's uncanny resemblance to my father, my mom struggled to find any rational explanation. Was it possible I had seen a stranger who looked like him? Or had it truly been something supernatural? In the end, we left the cemetery in silence, my mind still racing with what I had just experienced. The peaceful morning had turned into a strange and unsettling memory. For days after, I couldn't stop thinking about the encounter. Part of me wants to believe that I truly saw my father's spirit, lingering near his grave, watching over his loved ones from beyond. But another part of me wonders if it was simply a coincidence. A stranger who just so happened to resemble him in an uncanny way. If it was indeed a paranormal visit, though, why didn't his spirit fully reveal itself to me? Why remain so elusive? The questions linger, unanswered, as I continue to reflect on that strange encounter. And I wonder if my father was really there, or if something else, something I still don't understand, was watching over me. If you've experienced a terrifying event or have a horror story to tell, we at AG Horrors want to hear from you. Share your experiences with us on Reddit, and let's uncover the mysteries hiding in the shadows together. And if you want to support the channel and help us bring even more terrifying content, consider checking out our support options on Patreon or Ko-fi. Your support means the world to us. Be sure to like and subscribe to our channel for more spine-chilling stories like this one. And now, stay tuned for the next horror episode.